Good morning, church. Good to be with you again this morning. We've been going through a series on Paul, the life and times of Paul the Apostle, and we've been following him along the way, most recently on his second missionary journey. If you remember, the last couple of weeks we were following him through Thessalonica, and if you recall, the Jews got stirred up against him. He ended up having to leave town very quickly. We know later that there was violence against the new Christian converts there because we see some of Paul's writings to the church in Thessalonica later that intimates that. Paul leaves there and he moves on to Berea, where he has much more success with the Jews. But eventually, the Jews from Thessalonica who were jealous come along the way to Berea, and they agitate the people in Berea, and he eventually needs to leave Berea and move on to the next town as well. And so we see that some of the new Christian converts in Berea accompany him, we learn, in Acts chapter 17, to the next town of Athens. Now, this is not nearly as close of a jaunt as the previous couple of journeys were. If they were to go by land, it would be a 12-day journey. The other option would be for them to go by ship. And if they were to go by ship, it would be about a 3-day journey, and we suspect that that's exactly what took place. They accompanied Paul to the seaport, got on a ship with him, sailed with him to Athens. When they got with him to Athens, they returned with a message to bring back Timothy and Silas as quickly as possible. If you look at the map that I have, you can see the track where we see Berea, and we see on the red line, we can see Paul and those new Christian converts that would have accompanied him to the seaport. And you could see how he would travel on the interior of this long island, Euboea. And he would be passing along some very historical sites along the way, such as where the Battle of Marathon took place, and also where the Battle of Thermopylae took place. That would be where the 300 Spartan soldiers defended themselves and the country against Xerxes, who had reportedly up to 1 million men. And they defended that narrow passageway for 2 days. Eventually, they were outflanked by Xerxes' army. Xerxes' army was shown a back passageway by a local shepherd. But Leonidas knew that they were outflanking him, and he sent everybody else away except for the 300 who stayed behind and sacrificed themselves. So there was great historical sites that they would be passing along the way. Eventually, they would come to the Harbour Town for Athens, and that would be Piraeus. And there was actually an old harbor town, Philarium, and then there was the new harbor town, Piraeus. Interestingly, they had built walls both surrounding the city of Athens, which was 5 miles to the interior, and walls around Piraeus. Of course, you could not build walls that would defend the harbor, and they also built what were called the Long Walls, which stretched the 5 miles between the harbor town all the way to Athens. And you can see this on this photograph, or this rendering, I should say, of the Long Walls connecting the harbor town to Athens. And of course, this was a defense mechanism that they would use to prevent a land attack primarily. The only way to really get into Athens, because these walls were 60 feet high, they had towers at so many increments where they could defend those walls. The best way to get into Athens would have to be by water, through the harbor. And so it made it so that there would have to be a combination of a land and water attack, which would make it much more difficult. So we see these gigantic walls, and it almost made it like there was a third city in between the harbor town of Piraeus and Athens, because there was such a long stretch. There was a good amount of space in between the long walls, and people were hustling and bustling, and there were shops that would be set up along the way. And we can imagine Paul getting off the ship that he traveled on along with his traveling companions from Berea, and we imagine them walking along this highway of sorts all the way into Athens. And we can imagine the feeling that he would have had as his companions left and went back. He would be alone, he would be in this grand city, and the things that he would see would be very interesting. I've got a picture of a rendering that would show us the harbor town, and you can see the long walls leading towards the city of Athens off in the distance. And we can imagine Paul walking along that way. This next photograph that I have kind of shows the layout of the Acropolis. You can see the Acropolis, which would be where the large temples that we think of when we imagine ancient Greece and the big temples set upon the high elevation. We can see the Agora, which would be the open place where there would be lots of shops, lots of hustling and bustling in Athens, in the downtown area. And this would be where we would find Paul every day preaching to those who would hear him. But we would also find many other schools of philosophy in Athens. And this was what Paul was up against. He was facing a very educated, intelligent populace in Athens, where they had many schools of philosophy. This would be where Socrates had spent time. This would be where Plato had spent time. And then more recently, we would see the Stoics and the Epicureans, and we'll get more to them in a little bit. But I wanted you to kind of show you the layout. Now, here's a picture of what used to be the Agora, the kind of open area. In Athens, it's a little bit tighter, and it was surrounded by so many of these statues, these idols, these graven images. And Paul saw these things everywhere. And there was a statue or an altar to almost anything that you could think of. In fact, we're told that in the day that Paul visited, there was 2,000 to 3,000 idols that you could view as you would walk into this agora. It was just adorned with idols to everything imaginable, to the god of fame, of modesty, to the god of energy, to persuasion. There was even a god to an altar to the god of pity. And there was also one to the unknown god, and Paul is going to touch on that later. Interesting, there was a certain characteristic about the Athenians. They used to love to talk about whatever was new. They wanted the newest philosophy, the newest news. And so you know how when we greet one another, we often say, well, what's up? What's happening? Well, the way that they would greet one another would be, what's newer? What's newer? Because they didn't want to talk about yesterday's news or yesterday's philosophy. It was what's the latest and greatest. What's newer is how they would greet one another. And so they were interested to hear what Paul had to say. So he would definitely have a gathering around him when he would speak every day in the Agora. So there was a picture of the Agora for you. Here we have at a distance what it looks like when you look at the Acropolis. That would be that very elevated rock outcropping there in the background, and you can see one of the Greek temples that is kind of iconic for the Acropolis. And if we move on, you can see kind of a view from now on top of the Acropolis to the city down below. You would actually, from the Acropolis, be able to see the harbor, and you can see that off in the distance. And sometimes when we read through these stories, it's hard to imagine the setting until you're actually there. Fortunately, my family and I got to go visit Athens in 2014. So this would be when my youngest son, Garrett, was about 12, and my oldest son, Tyler, was about 15. So I'm going to show you some of the pictures as we go along the way, this being one of them, this picture from the Acropolis out towards the harbor to give you kind of the context. Now, this is not one of the photographs I took. This is a drawing, a rendering of what the Acropolis would have looked like from down below in the Agora, or from perhaps the area of Mars Hill, where we're going to read that Paul did a lot of his preaching in today's lesson. But that would have been what it looked like in the day that Paul was there. Here's a picture from our trip. The temple there was under construction. They were doing maintenance on it, so they had scaffolding and workers that were everywhere about taking care of and trying to reface and fix some of the damage that is occurring on some of these buildings. This next picture that I'm showing, I put in here just so you can see the scale of that temple. That's Garrett in the gray shirt, kind of in the middle. That's Tyler to the right of him, and Sheila to the right of Tyler there. But look at the scale of the columns that we're looking at. Garrett, his head doesn't even come up to the bottom of those columns. The foundation of that structure is gigantic. The columns are gigantic. So you can imagine when Paul first came rolling into town, and as he enters into the city proper of Athens, viewing this Acropolis for the first time, even for somebody today, it is magnificent. It's a powerful thing to behold. I had this next picture that I wanted to show you just so you can see some of the ornamental construction that was on some of these structures. Here we see these statues that are at the top of one of these buildings kind of holding up the roof line, and you can see how you can see the city below and kind of through these ladies that are here in this picture. Amazing, intricate construction, like you just would not believe. The columns that were often adorned at the tops of them with vines and flowers and all kinds of decoration. It was truly magnificent. Here is the goddess Athena that's in one of the local buildings there. You can see this gold outer layer that it was constructed of, and you can see how large it is. Look at the people that are in the foreground of the statue looking at it. This is what was everywhere in Athens. It was really something to behold. Now, this next picture I have for you is a picture from the Acropolis, where that big temple was, that iconic temple. Looking downward, you can see this other rock structure, and that is the Areopagus, or Mars Hill, and that's where Paul is going to be preaching to the local philosophers in today's lesson. If you kind of look at the base of that rock outcropping there, Mars Hill, you can see some steps that go up to the top. There's just a few steps that lead up to the top, and on this next picture you see myself and Tyler and Garrett standing at the bottom of these steps. And I wanted to put these pictures in here because I was fascinated by it, because I knew that Paul had walked up these very steps. You know, we travel to a lot of places where the apostles had trod, where Jesus had trod, and there's only a few places where we know precisely, okay, Paul or Christ had to have stepped in these exact spots. And this is one of them. These few steps leading up to the top of the Areopagus or Mars Hill, we know that Paul had to traverse these stairs to get to the top. And so I wanted to take a couple of pictures of that. Here's Garrett and myself about halfway up. And then in this next slide, we can see a closer up view. I wanted to get a real close-up view of these steps where I know that the Apostle Paul's feet touched. For me, that was powerful. When we get to the top, this next picture shows kind of a reverse view. We look from the Acropolis down on top of Mars Hill. Well, now we're all standing on top of Mars Hill, and we're looking up at the Acropolis. And I wanted this shot because we can imagine, as Paul begins to preach in today's lesson to the philosophers of Athens, we can imagine what it looked like, and Paul motioning towards the Acropolis and these large structures, beautiful temples of these pagan Greek gods. And it's very powerful for everybody to kind of have a view of how this would have actually looked. I want you to also notice the surface of the rocks that we're standing on. It was a very smooth, slippery rock from all the people that had visited. I don't know if it was smooth like this in Paul's day, but now it was almost slick to the point where we had to be real careful, because you can see how undulating the top of Mars Hill is. And it was real slick, and I was afraid I was going to fall. And so I was kind of treading very carefully as we walked along the way. But you can see the shininess of the stones there, and that's because it's polished, I suppose, from all of the traffic of people walking on that over all of these thousands of years. Now this brings us to Acts chapter 17 and verse 16. And we read there that now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, this would be Silas and Timothy, to come to him, it says his spirit was being provoked within him as he was beholding the city full of idols. And I mentioned that there was 2,000 to 3,000 idols and altars and temples to these Greek gods of everything that you could imagine. And it was stirring his human spirit within him. He was frustrated by what he was seeing. He was probably depressed by what he was seeing. And he was probably thinking, how in the world am I going to preach to these people in such a state where this is what they believe in? Clearly, it was a polytheistic society where they believed in many, many, many gods. And how is he going to approach that? It's going to have to be a completely different approach from how he has approached the Jews from before, or those Gentiles who had converted to Judaism. And so how is he going to preach to these people who believe in these things? It was going to be difficult, and he knew it. Verse 17 says, so he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews. That's the very first part of verse 17. You know, it would be really easy for Paul to have gotten pretty depressed about his previous attempts at dealing with the Jews. Yes, he had been successful in Berea with the Jews, but think about Thessalonica before that, about how he had been violently run out of town and how the Christians there had been treated so poorly after he had left. What about in Philippi, where as he was preaching to the Jews, he is arrested, he is beaten with rods, he is thrown into jail, put into the stocks. Think about on his first missionary journey, where he is stoned by the Jews in Lystra. And now here he is going to Athens, and what does he do? He doesn't shirk from going to the Jews, as is his custom, and first starting with them, because he knows that they should be the easiest to convert. They are the chosen people of God in the Old Testament, and now he is wanting to show them that Jesus is indeed the Christ, the Messiah that was prophesied by the prophets of old. And so he would always start with the Jews. He didn't shirk it. So we're told that he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. And so we can imagine that picture of the agora that I showed you, and Paul there with many other people in small groups. He probably had a small group of people around him every day. And what would he be teaching? He would be teaching that Jesus was the Christ, and that he was the Son of God, and that his Father, Jehovah, had been the God who had created the heavens and the earth. And this would be something new to these people, because they did not believe that. Verse 18, we read, and also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. And some were saying, what would this idle babbler wish to say? Others, he seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. What did they mean by this comment, that what would this idle babbler wish to say? The connotation is that he is almost like a bird, picking a seed up of information here, a seed of information, a kernel of philosophy here, and that he's combined it all together. But they are accusing him essentially of learning everything that he was teaching from them, that he had taken a little bit of information here and there, and he had combined it together and trying to make something new. And so they initially were kind of casting off what he was saying as, this really isn't new. He's just an idle babbler. He's just throwing some things together and trying to come up with something new. Then we move on. He had mentioned two of the different schools of philosophy that he ran into, students, disciples of those philosophers, while he would be in the agora, in the marketplace, and he would be preaching to these people. And I wanted to discuss some of the main tenets of those two philosophies. The first one is the Stoics. And we see Zeno, he would be the father of Stoicism. What's interesting about Zeno is that he is originally from very near where Paul was from in Cilicia. And Paul was not foreign to the philosophies of the Stoics. You could name 6 very famous Stoics that came actually from Paul's hometown of Tarsus. So he had heard their philosophies. He had heard them teaching before in his hometown. He knew exactly what they were teaching. And he was going to be a very good arguer with them. And we're going to see that as he begins to preach to some of them shortly. But some of the main tenets, and by the way, they would meet the students of Stoicism in this porch, and they called the porch a stoa in Greek. And it was the stoa porkyli, and that was the painted porch. And so there would be a mural that was painted there, and every day the Stoic students would meet and they would study at the feet of their teachers. And there would also be another garden in the Agora area, and this would be where the Epicurean school would meet every day. And so Paul was continuously running into these disciples of these different philosophies. So we have the Stoics. They would teach that man is perfect and that he is self-sufficient. They would teach that self-control or detachment from emotion was paramount. And that's, really, in modern day English, that's what someone who is stoic, we think about someone who is stoic, that's what we think about them in the face of things that are not going very well. They don't show a lot of emotion. They're able to bear up under some difficult thing that is going on in their life, maybe the loss of a family member, the loss of a job, a misfortune of finances. And so a Stoic believed that they needed to not let themselves get real energized or real upset about anything, positive or negative. And so they wanted to be real even keel, and that would allow them to use their logic. The other thing that we see is that it was really an education of pride in the human existence. But really, when you boil down to it, they were pantheists. They believed that the universe was God, that there was no real higher power of God, but that what we know to be created by God, they believed that that creation was God. That was God to the Stoics. And they also believed that at death, that the body and the soul, what made you on the inside, your mind, your heart, that was all just absorbed back into the earth, back into the universe, and would be no more. Kind of a sad commentary about what comes after death. We see that actually a lot today as well. What about the Epicureans? We see the father of this philosophy being Epicurus, who was in the middle 300s to the 200s. And we see his philosophy being something where they believe that the universe is infinite and eternal. And really, they were more atheists. They really didn't believe in God, per se. And some of them that would lean towards their Greek counterparts who believed in all these multiple gods, they would kind of go along with that. But they really didn't believe that those gods had any interaction with mankind or that they had any influence on the workings of humanity, and that there was no interaction, if there was a God, between God and mankind. And that they also believed that death was the end of the body and the soul. So neither of these schools of philosophy believed in life after death. Once you're dead, you're dead. You're dead all over. That's what they believed. And so it was kind of a sad, and you can imagine Paul as he's walking through the agora every day, listening to these philosophers, looking at these multiple idols, just thinking, what a sad state of affairs this is. And so in verse 22, we read this. It says, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God. What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you.'" So in verse 22, what we see is that many of these philosophers, these students, have been hearing Paul in the agora, in the marketplace every day. And finally they've said, you know what, we want to hear more from you. And so they took him up those few steps up to the top of the Areopagus, Mars Hill. And there would have been a crowd of people around to listen to what Paul had to say. And there would have been two hewn out stones where they would sit. There would be one person sitting across from another, and there would be somebody that would have been asking Paul questions, and he would have been answering. But it was more really a sermon that Paul had delivered. And he started it with this verse in 22 saying, "Hey, I've been walking around your town here, and I noticed that you have this altar to the unknown God. Let me tell you who this unknown God is. Let me tell you a little bit about this unknown God." And then he launches into a sermon where he really rips apart the fabric of both the Stoic and the Epicurean philosophies. In verse 24, he says, "The God, the real God, who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples." And you can imagine Paul waving his hand up to the Acropolis. Remember that view I showed you from the top of Mars Hill up to the Acropolis where you could see the gigantic temple up there? You can imagine him waving his hands. God doesn't live in a temple made with hands, not the real God. He's larger than that. He's bigger than that. This would have caught the interest of the philosophers. They would have been, okay, let me hear a little bit more. In verse 25 it says, "Neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything." You know, oftentimes the Greeks would make a sacrifice, and they would put it on an altar to the god, thinking that the god needed to consume the food that they would be sacrificing to it. And here is Paul basically stating, no. The God who made the world, you, everything in it, does not need to be served by you or by your hand. He doesn't need any help from you in anything. Don't be mistaken. And so this would have also maybe been a little bit interesting to the philosophers. And then we see in verse 30, he says this, he says, therefore, having overlooked the time of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man who he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. This would have been where the people would have had a problem. In fact, the sermon pretty much ended at this point because there was a lot of dissension to what he had just said, mainly about the resurrection. Neither of the schools of philosophy there, the Stoics or the Epicureans, believed that resurrection could be possible. No, they believed that when you're dead, you're dead. When you died, you're dead, like Rover the dog, you're dead all over. And so, as soon as he mentioned the resurrection, that pretty much ended the preaching for the day. But we see that he's making reference to Jesus, who he's talking about. That's the man appointed, and furnishing proof that he was indeed the Son of God, the Messiah that had been prophesied of old, by his resurrecting from the dead. And although he didn't mention Jesus by name, that's who he was referring to. But he also made that point earlier in verse 30. He said, therefore, having overlooked the time of ignorance, God did. God is now declaring to all men everywhere. What did he mean by that? How did he overlook the time of ignorance? The idea was that God was always looking forward in the history of the world. He was always looking forward to the time when Christ would come and he would give himself on the cross for your sins and for mine. He was always looking forward to this time that Paul was now in, where Christ had given himself on the cross to cover your and my sins. And he was looking forward to his plan coming to a pinnacle, coming to an apex, being fulfilled as we read on the pages of New Testament writ. And so we see this, Paul laying out exactly who God is, that there is only one God, that he actually created everything, that he has a personality, that he's interested in you having an eternal life with him in heaven, and it is through his Son who gave his life. What a powerful message for the Athenians back then, and although most of them rejected it, we learn in the very last verse, verse 34, there's only two people that were named in this particular chapter that had converted. It was Dionysius, the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris. Those were the only two that were named. We know that there was others with them that also converted, and so there was a small handful. Paul never writes back to the Christians in Athens, so we don't know much more, but we see that he had a difficult time making inroads, and a lot of it had to do with their philosophy that they did not have to uphold any kind of a bar or an example of righteousness. They did not want to believe that there was any standard that they needed to be held to. No, the Stoics, they really believed that using logic and having leading a life that was good, but they had no real sense of value or what was good and what was bad. They knew that if you were in pain, that was probably a result of living an evil life. And if you were doing well, that means that you were probably living a life that was moral and ethical, but they really had no standard. And the Epicureans had absolutely no standard. Their standard was that they wanted to lead a life of peace and tranquility, but more pleasure than anything else. That was their ultimate goal, and that led to a lot of sinful practices in their students. And so the idea that mankind should attain or live up to some kind of a standard was repugnant to them, and they didn't want to hear that. But it's the same thing that we see today. And we see this kind of postmodern ideal being taught to our children and our schools for now 3 generations. That really there is no standard that you need to adhere to. They've taken God out of the schools in every way possible. They've taken prayer out. They've taken our 10 Commandments out. You can't even mention God in the schools anymore. It's become so ridiculous. But now we see the effect on families. We see divorce rates through the roof. We see single-parent families everywhere. And we see the result, the emptiness, just as the Athenians had. The Athenians were always looking to be filled with something about the meaning of life. That's why they were always in search of it, but they could never quite get there. But we have the same emptiness and longing for something bigger and better, in especially the young people of today. And we see the rioters all over the United States now rioting, and we see how unhappy, how violent, how discontent they are. And it's not really all about racism. It has to do with a much larger picture. God has been removed from the schools. It's been removed from the family. And now we have people that are angry about their situation, about their place in the world, and they need God in it. That's the only thing that's going to improve their status. We're going to end with the invitation, as we customarily do. If you have not put on Christ in baptism, tomorrow is not promised to you. If you need prayers of the congregation, we can pray with you, and we can pray for you. If you'd like to put on Christ in baptism, you can call up to the building and talk to Chris. If you have my number, you can reach out to me or to Mick, and we can make those plans, and I urge you to do so. Thank you for your time this morning.